Hello, this is a very brief history of the viola. The first question you might have about the history of the viola is, where did it come from? And the easy answer to that is just to say that it came from Italy, but it had its origins much farther back than that. There was a bowed instrument that was known as early as 900 AD, and it came from Middle Eastern countries. This instrument was described, there are no pictures of it and no instruments survive, but it was described in literary sources at the time. It was described as having a pear shape, and it had strings that one put their fingers down to stop it and to change the pitch. And then there was even a bow. So the bow was made of a curved stick and it had a string attached. And then they put rosin on the string in order to pull it across the other strings, the tuned strings, and to change the pitches. And this was around in, like I said, in the 9th century, the 10th century, 900s AD in Middle Eastern countries. Then as the Crusades happened, the instruments spread further east toward Europe and in France. And so these kind of medieval fiddles, as you will, became more known in places like Italy. So all string instruments, their names actually derive from the word viola. So some of the earlier instruments were called the viola da braccio, which is played on the arm, and that's what literally da braccio means, on the arm. Viola da gamba, which means on the leg, so it's played kind of in the same similar style as a cello. Violini, which means small viola, which is actually we call it violin now, small viola. Violone, which is a big viola, and violoncello, which means small bass viola. So really, we don't know that viola was the first instrument to have been invented, but it's interesting that it's the only one that is just called the viola, and everything else is derived from variations on viola, either small viola, big viola, or small bass viola. So there were several very important violin and viola makers in the 15 and 1600s. There was Andrea Amati of Cremona, Italy, and he is credited with being the person to have invented the viola, the violin and the viola, in their current modern shape that they are in now. There have been other modernizations that have happened later, such as lengthening the fingerboard and lengthening the neck and changing the angle of the neck, but he created that shape that we are so familiar with. Amati had two sons and a grandson, Nicola Amati, also of Cremona. And Nicola was apprenticed, had many very excellent apprentices that worked for him, including Antonio Stradivari. And then there was another area of Italy where instruments started being made, and that was in Brescia, Italy. And so Gasparo da Salo was a contemporary of Andrea Amati and made violins and violas around the same time that he did. But his instruments, he had a little bit of a different shape than Amati, but basically the same. So the changing role of the violin and the viola in history, you can see on the left, that is a depiction of an angel playing a rebec. So the rebec was often, or the medieval fiddle, was often used by farmers and by just normal people to accompany themselves as they sang or as entertainment. But later, as Amati refined the making of these instruments, they became instruments that were more fit for a royal presentation. And so they were used in courts to accompany dancing. And as they became, the instruments themselves became more part of the entertainment, such as this picture in the right, which is depicting the Baroque era in the 1600s. Um, the instruments became, they needed to have them play a little bit more loudly. On the left, the rebec is a very soft sounding instrument that blended well with the voice. And then as the instrument modernized, as the violin and viola took shape and the cello, they wanted the instruments to be a bit louder so that they could be heard over a party or over a dancing. So some of the first viola concertos written, we usually think of the first viola concerto as being the Telemann viola concerto, and that's because it was the first viola concerto that was published. Before that, before 1731, the viola was pretty much just used as had a supporting role in orchestras or in ensembles, and it really did not take any kind of a solo form until 1731 when Telemann wrote his viola concerto. And I'm going to play a little bit of it for you. Hopefully this works. All right. So, oh, I didn't mean to do that. Let me go back. All right. So, the Telemann Viola Concerto is a beautiful concerto that was written, and it was, as you can see, this performance was done by a Baroque orchestra, and so they were using mostly period instruments, although they're not. The neck is still looks to me to be longer, like a modern instrument, but she is using a Baroque bow. Then the Brandenburg Concerto Number 6, it was actually written in 1721, but it wasn't published. I don't think it was published during Bach's lifetime. I believe that he wrote them and sent them to a potential patron who never actually had the pieces performed, and it was forgotten until maybe the mid 1800s, I want to say, when they were rediscovered. So it was not actually published until long after Bach actually wrote it. The Brandenburg Concerto Number 6 is also written for two violas. Actually, I believe they're written for viola da braccio, which is essentially a viola, but anyway, they were written for two violas, not for a single viola. The Stamitz Viola Concerto was written around 1774, and another wonderful viola concerto, and then Mozart's Symphony Concertante, which is for a violin and viola soloist playing in equal parts, was composed in 1779. So you can see that within those 60 years or so, 60 or 70 years, we went from having our very first viola concerto published, and then having the viola take kind of a center stage along with a violin soloist in Mozart's Symphony Concertante. So some of the important violists in history. Paganini was more, of course, known as a violinist, but he had a great interest in the viola. And he actually commissioned Hector Berlioz to write a viola concerto for him. And so Berlioz, having maybe a better understanding of the characteristics of the viola than Paganini himself did, wrote Harold in Italy. And apparently, Paganini was not very pleased with Harold in Italy because it was not the kind of show-offy, virtuosic piece that he was looking for, so he never performed it. But Harold in Italy is a beautiful piece. And then Paganini did go on to write a piece for himself. Lionel Tertis, and Tertis was one of the first very well-known viola players, but he also was responsible for he experimented with different sizes of violas and basically came up with a model himself of a viola that he thought worked. And then William Primrose, oh, I should go back and say, Tertis also was very responsible for encouraging his students to commission compositions for the viola. William Primrose similarly did the same, tried to commission more works for the viola. Most notably, the Bartók Viola Concerto was a piece that he worked with Bartók to write. It was not finished before Bartók's death, but finished posthumously. And then I'd like to mention Lillian Fuchs. She's not maybe as well known as Primrose, but she was an amazing viola player. There are some wonderful recordings of her that exist on YouTube of her playing the Bach cello suites, for example. And Lillian Fuchs also wrote some pieces for the viola herself and was really quite extraordinary for her time in being a woman playing the viola in a time when there weren't that many women playing the viola because of such a large instrument. So that kind of takes you a little bit through the viola history, and I hope you have enjoyed this presentation.